Presiden Joko Widodo menggelar pertemuan bilateral dengan Sekjen PBB António Guterres di sela-sela KTT ke-43 ASEAN 7 September 2023. Jokowi menyatakan kerjasama ASEAN dan PBB diperlukan untuk menjaga perdamaian dan mengatasi masalah, termasuk masalah di Myanmar.
I'm very concerned about the current global situation. What expectation for the UN are getting bigger to create world peace.
Sekjen PBB António Guterres mengapresiasi Indonesia dalam penyelenggaraan KTT ASEAN dan KTT G20. António menilai Indonesia sebagai mitra PBB yang berperan dalam pembangunan berkelanjutan, aksi iklim, dan hak asasi manusia.
Allow me, Mr. President, to first of all congratulate Indonesia and congratulate you personally for what has been a remarkable diplomatic effort of Indonesia in world affairs, not only at ASEAN's level but globally. And indeed, the presidents of ASEAN, as the presidents of the G20, were remarkable examples of the combination of a very skillful diplomacy with the fidelity to principles, including the UN Charter.
António Guterres juga bertekad mengembangkan kerjasama antara PBB dan Indonesia serta negara ASEAN lainnya. PBB mengajak ASEAN memiliki moto seperti Indonesia, yakni Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, agar memiliki kesepahaman dan solidaritas.
Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini dalam sebuah wawancara eksklusif bersama Sekjen PBB António Guterres yang berada di Jakarta untuk menghadiri KTT ASEAN. Mr. Secretary General, thank you so much for your time.
It's a great pleasure.
I hear this is an exclusive interview. You don't do much interviews like this, so it's a great
It's the only one
honor.
in Jakarta.
It's the only one in Jakarta, so I'm really, really honored. Now, you are here for the ASEAN-UN Summit, and just quickly the significance of the summit, and what would you like to see come out of this ASEAN Summit?
Well, there are two things that for me are extremely important when we deal with ASEAN. Of course, there are many aspects related to ASEAN's activities in women, peace and security, youth, peace and security, forms of international cooperation in different areas, the contribution to peacekeeping, and I could go on and on and on with areas of cooperation between ASEAN and the UN. But there are two things that are for me absolutely essential. First, we live in a divided world. And the geopolitical divisions are undermining our capacity to respond to the challenges we face. You see the war in Ukraine, you see the climate change getting out of control. And ASEAN has this culture of dialogue, and you can be a bridge builder between East and West. And this role is extremely important to avoid the great fracture in which the world could be split into two, and that would be devastating for the world economy, and that would be also a big risk for security. And the second aspect is very much related to the most difficult issue that exists within ASEAN, which is Myanmar. Yeah. And we are fully supportive of ASEAN's five-point consensus and fully supportive of Indonesia's leadership in order to make sure that it is possible to go back as soon as possible to the release of prisoners and the re-establishment of a fully democratic regime in Myanmar, and at the same time that there is an effective response to the dramatic humanitarian needs of the Myanmarese population.
But how effective, or how what can be made better when it comes to ASEAN in addressing these global challenges, the multipolar world plus the human rights violation in Myanmar? Because so far these things have been going on. I have
to say ASEAN is playing a very important role. I'll give you an example. It was one country of ASEAN, Singapore, that is presiding the cybersecurity discussions within the UN, where some progress is being made in an area that is so divisive in the world. So ASEAN's initiative, ASEAN's convening power, the capacity to bring together. Look at so many summits in this ASEAN summit.
There's a lot of summits, a lot of
summits
dialogues.
with all countries around the world that matter. And so there is this capacity of ASEAN to bring together those that fight each other in many aspects, as you know, for ideologically, politically, and economically. And so ASEAN is already playing a very important role. You should not underestimate the role that you are playing. On the other hand, in relation to the crisis situation, let's be frank, I mean, when one looks at Myanmar, it's not a new crisis. It has been there for decades. It's very complex, it's very difficult, but I think ASEAN is doing the right thing, and we fully support ASEAN's efforts.
But what are the UN's role in all of this, particularly the human rights violations, not just in Myanmar, but all over the world that we see increasingly?
You have, as you know, the High Commission for Human Rights has been extremely active, not only denouncing the violations of human rights all over the world, but also cooperating with governments to improve their human rights regime. And we have the Human Rights Council, where countries come together, and that has been playing a very important role. If you look at two areas that I believe are very dear to the Indonesian people, both in relation to Myanmar and to Palestine, the Human Rights Council has been very firm in relation to the need to protect human rights of populations that are victims of different forms of oppression.
But Mr. Secretary General, as you mentioned, a lot of global challenges, a divisive world, lots of conflicts, the Ukraine, and we are post-COVID, economic recession in the developed world, and also there are threats like AI, for example, and cybercrime and so on and so forth. How do you see sort of the UN sort of capacity and capability in addressing all these global problems?
We are taking initiatives on all these fronts in the context of the next General Assembly and the different summits associated with General Assembly, the summit on the Sustainable Development Goals, the summit on finance for development, the summit on climate, but also in what we call our common agenda and the preparation of the summit of the future. We are pushing for a global compact in the information technologies and artificial intelligence. We just created our scientific advisory board, and I'll have a scientific advisory body in relation to artificial intelligence to be able to provide international community with ideas and proposals on how to manage, how to create forms of governance for these sectors. In relation to climate, we have been pushing enormously for the climate agenda in all its aspects. We have been putting on the table the reform of international financial institutions. When they were created after the Second World War, they were created based on what the world was at that time. Now the world has changed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we need to increase the voice of developing countries and the weight of developing countries in those institutions.
But how to
and
do
we have
that?
put on the table concrete proposals of reform, and we have been fighting in the preparation of the ICG summit and in the preparation of the G20 meeting in order to make sure that the international community puts this in the agenda. At the same time, we have been pushing a lot for debt relief in relation to developing countries that are in debt distress. We have proposed, and we hope to have a reference to it in the G20 meeting, what we call the Sustainable Development Goals stimulus, to be able to create conditions by different mechanisms to mobilize $500 billion additional US dollars per year to support the capacity of developing countries to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have initiatives in all these areas. There are two things we do not have: power and money.
Yeah.
So what we use is our capacity to raise our voice to defend what is fair, what is just, and at the same time to convene. And in the convening power, I think the UN has been able in many aspects to solve problems. I mean, we had, the Black Sea Initiative, and just to give you an example, you had this oil tanker, the Safar tanker, and nobody was able to solve the problem, and the UN assumed it, and now the oil that was in this tanker that could be destroyed at any moment and create a horrible situation in the Red Sea is in a solid new ship that can contain it without risks. So the UN is extremely active, not only in pushing for a better world in all the areas I mentioned, but in solving concrete problems that nobody else is able to do. I am a lot of confidence of the increasing role of Indonesia in international relations to be a factor of peace, to be a factor of stability, but also to be a factor of more justice in development for everybody.
But do you think the UN has evolved enough in order to face today's challenges, the multipolar world, the climate crisis, also the tension between USA and China, and of course the decision-making process of the UN Security Council? Is this something that we really need to address on the global level?
The UN has evolved in many aspects, but we still have a Security Council that again represents the world as it was after the Second World War and became very ineffective. It is true. But the UN is also the group of humanitarian agencies that are providing fantastic support all over the world. You have UNICEF, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the World Food Programme. So all this is UN. So sometimes people look at the UN as if the UN was the Security Council. No, the UN is a large number of organizations that around the world, we had just 2 days ago the World Meteorological Organization. It's the UN telling that we had the hottest summer ever in the Northern Hemisphere, but also it is the hottest ever, whatever hemisphere. You have seen how the UN has been extremely active in relation to the International Agency of Atomic Energy, going to Zaporizhia to avoid the nuclear catastrophe. So the UN has many different instruments, and that the UN is acting around the world, trying to solve problems in so many areas. But then we have a problem in itself, which is we have a Security Council that indeed is blocked because of the veto power, and that to a large extent, as I mentioned, as it represents the world after the Second World War, doesn't correspond to the world of today.
It's outdated now.
So let's reform the Security Council, but let's take profit of all the other very important things that the UN has and the UN can do.
But it is a priority for you, the fight to reform the Security Council?
It is. The Security Council has to reform the Bretton Woods system, has to reform all multilateral institutions. We live in a world that is more and more multipolar. You see it here. But multipolarity doesn't solve the problems of peace and security. Europe before the First World War was multipolar. You had the UK, you had France, you had Russia, you had Germany.
You had the former empires and the colonizers.
Alliances, but there was not a multilateral governance system. And the result was the First World War. We need strong multilateral institutions to make sure that a multipolar world creates conditions for international cooperation and not for international confrontation.
But talking about World War, is there a danger of another world war in the offing if, for example, problems like the war in Ukraine or also the climate crisis, which is really a crisis, this is something that is going to be causing conflict.
We are far from a third world war, and one of the merits of the UN is to have the largest period in which the superpowers of each time have not been fighting each other.
Yeah, the Cold War. They fight proxy wars.
Better cold than hot. I don't think we are on the verge of a third world war, but we have many risks in the international community, and we have geopolitical divides that are undermining our capacity to respond to the problems of climate that you mentioned and to the problems of security in many areas, to have a joint approach to the regulation of artificial intelligence and other things that can produce enormous benefits but then create enormous risks. So to address the geopolitical divides is a fundamental priority for us, and ASEAN is an ideal partner to help us in that regard.
Okay. In terms of the biggest threat, I mean, we have quite a few now. What would you consider as the biggest threat? And that needs to be addressed right now. I mean, we had the pandemic, obviously. That was,
Today's biggest threat is climate change. Another threat is the fact that we are seeing developments in the technology that, for which we have not yet a system of governance.
Which might create existential problems on the global scale.
That can create existential problems, let's hope not, but is already creating enormous difficulties with hate speech, with misinformation, with so many other areas in which you are, as a broadcaster, victim of those things. And at the same time, there is a serious concern with global peace and security.
And climate crisis. I mean, we have, it doesn't help having the war in the Ukraine. It doesn't help having US and China conflict or tensions in the region. What's the best way to address it, Mr. Secretary General? Because this is really very much, when we talk about existential problems, we are already experiencing climate crisis.
The best way is for everybody to wake up and to understand that there is no division on any issue that can justify that everybody does not cooperate.
But are you seeing countries waking up?
We are seeing several forms of cooperation. Look at Indonesia and Vietnam. There was an important partnership established, the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnership, that will be helping these two countries to reduce emissions. So, and
are you optimistic about that? Because are you optimistic about that? Because
no, these are two examples of what can be done. But what we have been telling the G20, the big emitters are in the G20. What we have been telling them is time to start scapegoating, to stop scapegoating the others, and to understand that both developed countries and the emerging economies must come together, put together their resources, and of course, developed countries have technology and financial resources that they need to fully bring into the picture, but put together resources and make sure that together they reduce the emissions, that together they stop this running to disaster that we have witnessed in the recent years.
Okay, I know your time is short. Just very quickly, SDG goals 2030. Are you optimistic we can achieve those goals? Very ambitious goals, but very important.
They are very ambitious, and even if we don't achieve them, they define the line that we should pursue, and they are being very useful for that. Many governments are organizing their policies in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, and we are very happy with the role of Indonesia in this regard. But let's be clear. If we do not have an international financial system that responds to the needs of developing countries, we will not be able to achieve many of the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay. And so the reforms of international financial system, and at the same time, the national reforms for good governance, to fight corruption, and to be able to mobilize national resources for the well-being of the people is also important. But national efforts are very important, but we need a more equitable world, namely in relation to the financial resources that need to be available for developing countries.
Absolutely. I mean, money is everything when it comes to fulfilling all these goals. Just very, very quickly again, Indonesia's role in all of this, leadership, what would you say, your comments about particularly President Jokowi's performance on the global stage?
The presence of the G20 in a very difficult moment, and it was very successful. If you remember, Indonesia was able to come to conclusions in G20, even if all of them were fighting each other inside. So Indonesia, the president of the ASEAN, again, extremely effective. So I believe Indonesia today is a very important bridge builder. It is a very important broker in international relations. And I am a lot of confidence of the increasing role of Indonesia in international relations to be a factor of peace, to be a factor of stability, but also to be a factor of more justice in development for everybody.
Okay, on that note, Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for your time once again. Have a wonderful trip, have a wonderful journey in Indonesia and back home, and wish you every success for the best.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you, and all the best for CNN Indonesia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So that's the key point. It's two-way trade and investment. So the terms of reference we were set, it's not just increasing Australia's exports to the region, it's as important to increase exports from the region to Australia.
Insight with Desi Anwar kali ini bersama Special Envoy for Southeast Asia Nicholas Moore. Dan Nicholas Moore baru-baru ini telah mempublikasikan sebuah buku yang berjudul Australia Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040. Nicholas, thank you so much for being with us. I mean, obviously you're familiar with Indonesia, right?
Very much.
Okay, you are here for the ASEAN Summit, and you're here with the your Prime Minister of Australia and the Foreign Minister. I mean, why is it so important, do you think, for Australia to be involved and to be here for this ASEAN Summit?
Well, ASEAN, of course, is the heart of the neighbourhood that Australia is part of, and so the prosperity and welfare of ASEAN is very much tied to the prosperity and welfare of Australia. And we've had a close relationship between Australia and Indonesia, and indeed the broader region, for many years now. And from a government-to-government viewpoint, very strong relationships exist and have existed. From a trade and investment viewpoint, though, our government, our incoming government last year, thought we were underdone, that we could be doing more trade and we could be having more investments between ASEAN and Australia. And so to this end, I was asked, which was announced at the last ASEAN conference in Phnom Penh, to step up and become the special envoy to focus on developing a strategy for Australian-ASEAN engagement between now and 2040. So a long distance, obviously we're talking 17 years of how we can actually increase trade and investment between ASEAN and Australia.
Why 2040?
It's just a date. It's a date that the government chose. The key thing about the strategy, we put one together. The way we put it together, we looked at some top-down indicators to look at the underlying trade story and to look at the underlying investment story. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, we went out and we engaged with businesses here in Indonesia and indeed in every country in the region with the exception of Myanmar, and businesses in Australia who were looking at trading and investing either in Australia or in the region. So a lot of discussions took place, and we asked them, how optimistic were you about your business and about the trade? The answer is people were very optimistic, which is great. Secondly, what can the government do to actually increase trade and investment? And so from this feedback, we're able to filter them all, distill them, and we've come up with 75 different recommendations which we provided to the government yesterday in terms of the steps we think the Australian government can take, and together with the governments of the region, to increase two-way trade and investment. And I guess that's the key point, it's two-way trade and investment. So the terms of reference we were set, it's not just increasing Australia's exports to the region, it's as important to increase exports from the region to Australia. But is there a target
on how much increase you're hoping to get by 2040?
We've got some numbers in here, but we know exports, two-way trade will increase. The question is the pace that will be increasing. And two-way trade has been increasing in recent years, but we think it hasn't matched the growth that we've seen in the region. So it's a question about the rate of growth, and we're ambitious. And the good thing is we're ambitious and we're optimistic.
Yeah, and as the title of this summit is the ASEAN Matters Epicentrum for Growth, and if we look at the world, globally, this region is the center of growth. I mean, we see Europe and the US, suffering from economic recession and wars in the Ukraine and so on and so forth. So there is still growth here. But can I just focus a little bit more on Indonesia, since we are in Indonesia, and since Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN. And over the past years, relationship between Indonesia and Australia, it's always been fluctuating. It's up and down, and there's a sense that Australia perhaps has been focusing more on its traditional partners, whether it's the Europe or the US, and also maybe like China. How will the strategy differ from what it used to be in terms of trade and investment? What will change significantly?
Okay. Well, I think just in terms of the relationships between our two governments, they are very strong. And one of the great facts is Australia's largest embassy is here in Jakarta. So if you look at the number of people on the ground, we have more people in Jakarta than any other city in the world.
Well, we're the nearest neighbour. I mean, if you look on the map, right?
Well, it says it's the most important in terms of the number of people from an embassy viewpoint. So I think that's very significant. In terms of the relationship, I mean, my personal experience doing business here in Indonesia goes back to the mid-80s, so 40 years ago. And I came here to review Snowy Mountains Engineering Corporation, which was an Australian company owned by the Commonwealth Government that was working on building bridges, aid projects here across Indonesia. Now there's a long history, obviously, of very strong Australian-Indonesian relationships built upon a whole range of different features, including developments. I think that's very strong. And looking at those programs in place here today, such as the Prospera program, adding a lot to what's happening already. But as you quite rightly say, we would like to see it not just very strong from a government-to-government viewpoint, which it is also strong from a trading viewpoint, but as I said, we're ambitious for it to be stronger from a trading viewpoint. And in particular, we'd like to see more investment. So in terms of foreign direct investment between Australia and Indonesia, indeed Australia and the region, we are well underdone in terms of where we sit today. So we'd like to see how we can, and our recommendations go in terms of how we can actually increase the amount of investments coming into the region. Very committed to the neighbourhood, very committed to deepening economic trade and investment, two-way economic trade and investment between Australia and the region.
Okay. Can you be more specific about the opportunities there are, not just for Australian companies doing business in Indonesia, but also Indonesian companies, because you mentioned about the two-way trade.
Absolutely.
What are the sort of the low-hanging fruits that you can actually really step up, on these particular sectors?
Well, one of the recommendations we have, which the government's acted on already, so the government's got the report yesterday and has already acted on 3 recommendations, which is
good feedback.
Which is very good. That's very terrific. And the commitment of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to be here in Jakarta, not just for the meetings, but to launch this. I think it sends a very powerful message that the government is committed to this relationship stepping up from a trade viewpoint. So one of the features announced yesterday was that the Australian government would be funding a campaign within Australia to encourage exports from the region to Australia. One of the things we would like to be saying to all Australian importers is, why not ASEAN? So a lot of the imports we receive today, of course, come from China, as they do in the rest of the whole world. Everyone's looking for a China plus one strategy from a business viewpoint. Obviously, COVID has shown the risks of dependency on one. Now, that's a big story globally. It's a big story, obviously, for Indonesia and for the whole region, but it's also a story for Australia. So we would like the Australian government to be helping that story in terms of actually putting at the forefront of companies importing, to be saying, look at the suppliers in the region, look at what they can be doing for you. So we think that's very important. Other sort of recommendations that we're making go to broader awareness. Just how aware are people in Indonesia of the opportunities in Australia? How aware of Australian investors of the opportunities in Indonesia? And the answer is it could be a lot better. So again, one of the recommendations is how do we increase two-way trade of movement of people between the two places to actually see what the opportunities are. And even deeper than that, again, one of the recommendations that was accepted yesterday was having the exchange of young professionals between Australia and the region.
The people to people.
People to people, that's right. That's so important. So a lot of our recommendations in terms of capability building, both in Australia and the region, focus on that people to people exchange. How can we've got a very strong university sector. Good news here in Indonesia, we've got to have 4 Australian universities licensed here, which is terrific. We've got 1 at the moment with Monash and 3 more being licensed. That's very powerful, but also a lot of people in Indonesia historically and today are doing education in Australia. So how do we broaden that education experience? How do we make sure it's a richer experience for all concerned?
Companies or Australian companies as a whole, how excited are they about investing in ASEAN, or especially in Indonesia, and in what areas? I mean, obviously, Indonesia, we rely a lot, for example, on agricultural products from Australia, but we also are developing in terms of creating infrastructure, and the renewables, green energy. And I mean, we're a nation of 370 million people with a lot of needs. How aware are Australian?
Well, I think we'd like to say they're not aware enough, but our objective is to make them more aware. And so in terms of the opportunities, as you quite rightly say, each one of those are priority sectors that we've covered in our report, we're actually listing
agriculture, and
agriculture,
food,
of course, as you mentioned, education, which we talked about, the green energy transition. So I think we're very aware of the opportunities here. We're very aware of the needs in Australia. We're very aware of the need to develop a workforce that can actually work in terms of delivering projects in Australia and work on delivering projects here. In terms of infrastructure, as you mentioned, that's very much highlighted as a key area of focus. We've got a very substantial infrastructure investment industry in Australia, in our superannuation funds that have $3.5 trillion under management, going to $9 trillion. We think that this could be a good source of infrastructure investment for Indonesia. What we need to do is unlock that and find out how, and we have recommendations in terms of how we do it.
Do you come here with a lot of Australian investors? I mean, not the ones already here, but new ones, prospective,
exactly,
the ones.
Exactly. So coincidentally, we didn't organise this, but there's 170 different Australian businesses here this week as part of the ASEAN conference. Now, 130 of those are from Western Australia, but still 40 of them are more broadly. So yes, the interest in Indonesia from Australia just increases and continues to grow. The energy transition one we talked about, the resources one we talked about, obviously a lot of discussion in terms of critical minerals, in terms of lithium, in terms of nickel, what's happening with batteries. A lot of discussions taking place down there. So yes, there's a lot of interest out there, and we think there's a lot more opportunity for that to grow.
And we talk about blockages, from both just the business climate, both from the regulatory points of view and also just, the incentive for foreign investment. What would you say can be better, both done by the Australian government as well as what's needed to be done by the Indonesian government? Obviously, all these two-way trade needs a lot of, obstacles removed.
That's right. Well, we've got in place very good government-to-government arrangements in terms of Australia, New Zealand, ASEAN agreements about how we can move goods. But there are practical problems that happen at the port anywhere. And so what we're recommending here is to have more Austrade officials available to sort out problems as they happen, because there will always be problems that happen. And what we need is to have the investment and the resources on the ground here in terms of people who can actually help that flow. The other way around, of course, from an Indonesian-Australian viewpoint, some of the feedback we received was on questions such as FIRB, which is a Foreign Investment Review Board, the procedure, the process around that, how can we simplify it, how can we make it easier, visas, of course, for investors and for tourists and for students, how can we make that better? And again, they're subject to current reviews in terms of how to improve that. And we also make a recommendation that we can have a single door in terms of concierge service, in terms of investors or people coming to Australia to make it easier.
Just to make it easier to do business.
Exactly, because we see that operating effectively in Singapore. They do a very good job of it. So there's a lot we can learn. Australia's more complex because we've got a Commonwealth, a federal government, as well as that we have a whole range of state governments. So things are quite complex, but we can make it easier. And that's what we're recommending here, to have a whole of government approach to make it easier for people to be accessing Australia. And similarly, we'd like to be working with the governments of the region in a similar way to make access easier the other way. So within this neighbourhood, to have a good ability for people, goods, capital to move between the different countries.
Finally, because I'm interested in your role as a special envoy. Does that include overseeing or at least monitoring the implementation until 2040, so that at the end of it you could make a sort of another book, to see how much has been done and how well the strategy has been implemented?
I can't guarantee where I'll be in 2040.
But strategy is good on paper, but it has to be
raising a very
implemented.
good point. So one of the great things the government, when they received the report yesterday, committed to is to review it annually, review progress annually in terms of how we're going against the underlying objectives of the report. So we've got 75 recommendations. We're seeing three of them will be being implemented straight away, but the government has committed to work on all the recommendations and to be reporting back effectively annually about how we are going against the suggestions that we've made.
Okay, that would be interesting.
Of
I
course.
mean, 2040 is actually just round the corner, really.
Yeah, well, let's hope not. Long way to go, but
Yeah,
hopefully,
long way to go, but
hopefully in a
you know,
year's time we can sit down with you and talk about what progress we've
absolutely.
made.
And I said, Nicholas, how many of these recommendations have actually been implemented? And is there a particular target that you yourself would like to see in terms of, you know, the number of?
There's a lot of work to be done here, and
increase?
some recommendations are more significant than others. I'm very optimistic. See very good progress. But given the commitment of the government, and we had the Prime Minister here launching it, we had the Foreign Minister launching it. They are very committed to the neighbourhood, very committed to deepening economic trade and investment, two-way economic trade and investment between Australia and the region.
Okay. Nicholas, thank you so much for your time and your insight.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Pleasure.
And I suppose you'll be distributing this to everybody here.
Exactly. It's going to be a bestseller, so I would treasure it. So thank you
All
very
right.
much for your time.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Nicholas. Ya, Insight with Desi Anwar bersama Special Envoy to Southeast Asia, Nicholas Moore. Tetaplah bersama kami.
Dengan leadership ASEAN, justru harapannya ya lebih berkontribusi lagi kepada sustainable development.
Insight with Desi Anwar kembali masih di suasana KTT ASEAN, dan kali ini saya berbicara dengan Armida Alisjahbana sebagai Undersecretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, atau biasanya dikenal sebagai ESPAC. Nah, Bu Armida, ini saya lihat ini KTT ASEAN ini banyak sekali orang-orang penting yang datang ke Jakarta. Kita lihat G20 tahun lalu Indonesia sangat-sangat berhasil menyelenggarakannya, dan kali ini juga KTT ASEAN ini berlangsung dengan baik. Tapi bagaimana dari segi action yang kira-kira bisa diimplementasi, khususnya misalnya yang paling penting menjadi fokus itu adalah sustainability, climate change, energy, dan juga menyiapkan opportunities atau peluang-peluang untuk berbisnis di ASEAN, Bu Armida.
Ya, terima kasih Mbak Desi. Senang sekali bisa ngobrol lagi di Indonesia. Selama ini tentu saya banyak dalam konteks Asia Pasifik ya. Sejak 2018 berkedudukan berkedudukan di Bangkok sebagai Regional Commission EKSKAP. Jadi coveragenya mengcover Asia Pasifik. Tapi kali ini karena ASEAN, Southeast Asian Nation juga dalam coverage kami, jadi saya juga ikut mendampingi Pak Sekjen dalam delegasinya Pak Sekjen ya kali ini. Dan tentu di samping itu juga yang penting mungkin sedikit background ya supaya teman-teman pemirsa juga mengetahui nih apa yang dikerjakan oleh EKSKAP. Jadi sebagai komisi regional, Regional Commission, kami juga banyak kerjasama selain dengan negara-negara secara langsung, juga banyak kerjasama dengan atau melalui ASEAN Sekretariat, ya, Sekretariat ASEAN Sekretariatnya. Dalam berbagai topik, khususnya kalau kami di EKSKAP, karena kami ini mengcover development issues, kami tidak mengcover politik, development. Sehingga kami kerjasama dalam topik-topik atau isu-isu terkait dengan ekonomi dan juga socio-cultural, dua pilar itu ya. Untuk ekonomi, kami banyak kerjasama untuk dua topik, khususnya trade dan investment. Trade dan investment ya, terutama trade facilitation dan bagaimana juga negara-negara bisa membangun misalnya ya aspek-aspek sustainability, resilience dan inclusiveness ke dalam regional trade agreement. Regional trade agreement misalnya RCEP ya seperti itu ya. Terus juga kami banyak kerjasama terkait dengan digital economy. Contohnya, kami juga banyak kerjasama terkait dengan investment. Tapi kalau investasi itu adalah bagaimana menarik negara-negara ASEAN ya, bagaimana menarik investasi FDI, PMA, tetapi yang sustainable, jangan asal PMA ya. Itu satu. Yang social cultural pillar, kami banyak kerjasama, misalnya satu dua topik, misalnya energi, energi transisi energi, itu kami sudah melakukan berbagai kegiatan itu sebetulnya jauh sebelum energy transition itu menjadi satu prioritas global, termasuk climate change juga ya, dan termasuk satu lagi nih yang juga banyak dihadapi oleh negara-negara ASEAN, yaitu mengenai disaster, natural disaster, khususnya sekarang
lebih sering lagi karena ada
yang disebut dengan climate induced disaster. Jadi disaster tetapi yang yang climate induced, bukan yang natural disaster seperti
karena
yang
perubahan iklim.
yang
kita merasakannya sekarang
diperparah oleh dampak perubahan iklim.
Cuaca ekstrim misalnya.
Nah, jadi itulah coverage kami, sehingga tentu yang diharapkan dari KTT ASEAN, dan kami juga sangat appreciate, Pak Sekjen tentu sudah menyampaikan sangat appreciate kepemimpinan Indonesia di dalam ASEAN dan dalam chairship sekarang, keketuaan sekarang, sehingga yang diharapkan adalah bagaimana ASEAN bisa contribute secara, karena ASEAN berapa population
638 juta sekarang.
Iya, hampir 650. Growth-nya, pertumbuhan ekonominya juga termasuk. Dan
growth-nya kan bisa dikatakan center of growth, epicentrum
salah satu yang terbaik, konsisten recovery dari COVID. Lalu digital is big di sini.
Young population.
Population. Meskipun yang population tidak semua negara. Misalnya Thailand, di mana kami berlokasi, itu sebetulnya sudah aging. Misalnya tapi negara lain, Filipina, Vietnam, Indonesia
demographic bonusnya masih.
Nah, jadi itu sangat potensial. Nah, jadi dengan keunggulan tersebut bagaimana dengan leadership ASEAN justru harapannya lebih berkontribusi lagi kepada sustainable development, dan istilahnya tuh mainstream memainstream sustainability, mengarusutamakan
bagian dari DNA pemerintah
di dalam berbagai inisiatif, termasuk investment tempo hari. Saya juga berkesempatan bicara di ABIS ASEAN Business Investment Summit. Kemudian kami juga bantu BKPM Pak Bahlil untuk ASEAN Investment Forum, the first one. Itu juga yang kami sampaikan. Tolong dong sustainability-nya betul-betul jangan asal narik PMA, relokasi PMA dan lain-lain, tetapi sustainability di dalam energinya, di dalam segala macam sektor-sektor yang dipromosikan dan sebagainya.
ESG sekarang, environmental, social governance, itu diharapkan perusahaan dan juga institusi, semua institusi memegang teguh lah ESG-nya. Nah, Sustainable Development Goals ini saya sempat tadi berbicara dengan Sekjen PBB António Guterres, dan kita kan punya target 2030 untuk memastikan semua goals ini bisa dipenuhi lah. Nah, Ibu Armida sendiri melihat khusus untuk ASEAN dan di Asia Pasifik, apa kira-kira yang masih menjadi prioritas untuk diselesaikan supaya SDGs ini tujuan Sustainable Development ini tercapai, dan kira-kira tantangan terbesar apa dalam mewujudkannya?
Jadi SDGs goals-nya ada 17 17.
Banyak sekali goals.
17 dan targetnya tentu turunannya banyak. Tapi intinya begini, tahun ini midpoint review, persis di tengah jalan. Assessment-nya bagaimana, progresnya bagaimana secara keseluruhan di Asia Pasifik dan pada umumnya berbagai negara juga tidak on track. Ke-17 goal itu off track, artinya kalau seperti ini kemajuannya pada tahun 2030 sulit tercapai Tetapi di antara sekian banyak tentu ada yang kemajuannya cukup oke lah, signifikan. Apa itu di region kita? Antara lain SDG 7. SDG 7 itu energi. Tetapi energi itu accessibility ya is okay, banyak progres. Efficiency juga mungkin some progress. Tapi renewable misalnya, energi baru terbarukan, energi bersih itu masih lagging behind. Kemajuan yang lumayan lagi adalah innovation infrastructure. Itu juga lumayan. Karena ya region ini Asia Pasifik kan terkenal ya. Banyak inovasi, lalu investasi infrastrukturnya juga seperti Indonesia kan banyak ya. Digital dan sebagainya. Jadi itu sesuatu yang positif ya. Dan some progress untuk health, goal terkait dengan health, education juga, tetapi education lagi-lagi lebih kepada akses dan sebagainya, quality masih belum ya. Tapi yang paling apa itu rapor merah itu yang terkait dengan climate change, environmental management, dan climate change itu yang raportnya merah. Ya, oleh karena itu ya kami dari UN juga berharap ya sebagai salah satu hasil KTT bagaimana ya lebih mengakselerasi lagi, mempercepatlah leadership, komitmen, implementasi yang konkret dari negara ASEAN yang terkait dengan kalau misalkan itu investasi atau project ya yang sustainable.
Iya, tapi Bu Armida sendiri ini kan across the board ya, tadi rapornya itu, termasuk rapor merahnya juga, jadi termasuk Indonesia kan?
Itu secara more or less itu.
More or less. Tapi kalau Indonesia sendiri, rapornya itu dibanding dengan negara-negara tetangganya itu bagaimana? Di mana kita posisinya?
Iya,
khususnya dalam rapor merah.
Gambarannya kurang lebih sama. Kurang lebih sama. Jadi untuk climate change, climate action juga yang PR-nya.
Kenapa kira-kira?
Secara
alasan.
Ya, banyak negara ya. Ya,
apakah karena kekurangan political will atau kekurangan financing? Kalau tadi Sekjen mengatakan salah satu adalah financingnya kurang. Atau kekurangan mungkin karena situasi global justru membuat orang itu tidak fokus terhadap hal-hal yang berkaitan.
Faktornya tentu banyak ya, tidak hanya satu, tentu banyak ya. Termasuk awareness, salah satu awareness. Yang kedua adalah opportunity, kesempatan ya. Tapi misalnya ya, begitu katakanlah private sector itu aware ya, dan in terms of proyek ya. Nah itu juga kalau misalkan investor mau invest kan harus ada proyek yang ready. Nah, proyek-proyek
yang sesuai dan yang bagus.
Yang ready itu juga harus proyek-proyek yang mendukung gitu. Misalkan energi bersih dan sebagainya. Nah, di sini kuncinya mungkin dua yang saya yakin Pak Sekjen juga menyampaikan, terutama untuk negara berkembang ya, yaitu teknologi dan finance. Jadi nggak hanya finance ya. Karena salah satu solusi itu tergantung teknologi. Untuk solusi untuk climate change, climate action ya, teknologi dan finance dan juga investasi ya, investasi yang ready, maka tentu swasta akan masuk. Nah, bagaimana peran pemerintah? Pemerintah itu di mana-mana juga kan tugasnya adalah meng-create yang namanya enabling environment,
regulasi yang tepat,
policy, regulasi, insentif. Atau disinsentif, jangan masuk ke mana sektor-sektor yang katakanlah yang tidak environmental friendly ya.
Nah ini rapor mengenai pemerintah dan insentif dan regulasi menurut Bu Armida bagaimana secara keseluruhan?
Dan saya rasa ya misalnya ya terkait misalnya contoh terkait dengan Indonesia salah satu prioritas tinggi Pak Jokowi, Pak Presiden adalah hilirisasi ya. Yang sangat bagus ya, hilirisasi, downstreaming berarti jangan mengekspor lagi produk raw
material
diproses. Nah, gimana ketika make sure ketika memproses dan sebagainya menggunakan energi bersih misalnya. Ketika diproses di dalam proses penambangan dan sebagainya juga memperhatikan dampak lingkungan. Nah, itu maksudnya. Jadi harus combine
Iya.
Ya.
Tapi saya lihat Indonesia kan lumayan
Iya.
political will-nya ada,
Oh, iya,
targetnya
iya, bagus,
ambisius.
bagus.
Cuman implementasinya
Bagus,
mungkin yang
iya.
masih harus
Ya, implementasi ya itu
diperbaiki.
tugas pemerintah lagi kan.
Iya. Nah, kalau Ibu Armida melihat suasana dari KTT ini kan juga para pelaku bisnis banyak ya datang
Banyak,
ke
iya.
sini. Ini kira-kira tertarik, apalagi negara intra ASEAN ini untuk berinvestasi khususnya di Indonesia dan di
Iya.
proyek-proyek yang sifatnya green
Iya,
ataupun
iya.
sustainable. Itu
Iya.
ada animonya ke sana.
Saya terus terang saya kan sudah 5 tahun di luar ya, tidak
Iya.
di Indonesia. Setiap kembali ke Indonesia, berkunjung atau apa begitu ada tugas ke Indonesia, selalu merasa istilahnya apa ya, energized, merasa energetik karena di sini apakah di KTT ASEAN atau pertemuan lain atau di dalam interaksi yang lain ya itu kita bisa merasakan energinya, merasakan bahwa ini adalah negara dan juga negara di dalam bagian dari suatu region, Southeast Asia region yang sangat dynamic. Itu terasa. Terasa, iya.
Ikut bangga juga dong.
Iya, dan setiap kali kita kembali ya, artinya di Indonesia ataupun negara ASEAN lain, misalnya datang lagi kalau negara lain ya, setahun kemudian, 2 tahun kemudian kita langsung lihat ada yang baru, ada yang ini berkembang dan sebagainya. Dan itu kita rasakan. Ya, yang saya rasa
Optimismenya itu ada.
iya,
ya, di sini.
dan juga progres, nggak
Progres.
hanya
tidak hanya lari di
progres, ya.
tidak hanya jalan di tempat.
Iya.
Tapi mungkin apa Bu Armida sendiri harapkan khususnya berkaitan dengan aspek ekonomi, sustainability dan juga energi tadi dan poverty reduction kan itu juga sangat penting, inclusivity
Iya.
yang keluar dari KTT ASEAN ini yang harus segera diimplementasi Bu Armida dalam waktu jangka pendek.
Dari ekonomi dan socio-cultural ya, saya rasa bagaimana juga, dan itu sudah diadopt ya di Economic Ministers waktu di Semarang. Tentu banyak, tapi kalau boleh ya saya angkat satu saja. Dan kebetulan kami juga kerjasama ya dengan melalui ASEAN Sekretariat, yaitu mengenai inclusiveness.
Ya.
Itu kan kayak keyword ya, kalau nggak ini. Apa sih maksudnya? Jadi, misalnya ambil contoh investasi atau bisnis. Ya, ada jalur cepat ya, yang corporate ya. Melalui EBEC ya, EBIS, Investment Forum dan sebagainya. Tetapi di lain pihak mungkin 90% lebih ya, di semua negara ASEAN unit usahanya itu kan skala small medium, bahkan ada mikro ya, small and medium enterprise.
UMKM kan.
Di mana ini? Kalau enggak kan yang satu jalan ke sini, yang satu jalan ke situ gitu ya. Nah, oleh karena itu kita juga sangat mensupport, menencourage yang namanya inclusive business. Bisnis tapi inklusif. Apa itu inclusive business? Pertama adalah membantu UMKM, itu yang standar lah ya. Yang supaya mereka lebih
punya akses terhadap modal,
akses,
misalnya,
kualitas,
pasar,
standarisasi dan seterusnya, dan banyak negara sudah lakukan. Yang kedua adalah untuk sektor-sektor tertentu, it doesn't mean semua sektor ya. Bagaimana si UMKM ini setelah terstandar dan berkualitas ya, juga bisa contribute atau masuk ke value chain. Value chain ini bisa national value chain, bisa dalam konteks ASEAN regional value chain. Contoh misalkan industri otomotif, itu kan pemasoknya kan UMKM, tapi udah terstandar ya, dan seterusnya. Dan ini yang bagaimana ya, mudah-mudahan ASEAN juga ada inisiatif yang untuk mengcombine, mensinergikan. Karena sekarang kan yang corporate satu, yang ini. Nah, jadi dengan inclusive business itu juga untuk inequality, untuk menanggapi atau mereduce ya masalah
Apalagi
kesenjangan.
di Indonesia itu ekonomi kita kan tulang punggungnya itu
Iya,
adalah
iya,
UMKM
iya,
lebih dari bisa dikatakan 90%
Iya,
dari perusahaannya itu entrepreneurship-nya dalam skala yang
Iya.
sangat kecil. Jadi kalau kita memperkuatkan ini bisa sangat
memperkuat,
terbantu.
lalu dikembang juga
Iya.
dia masuk ke value chain.
Iya. Bu Armida, terima kasih banyak
Terima
atas
kasih.
waktunya,
Terima
atas
kasih.
insight-nya. Semoga sukses.
Terima kasih.
Ya, demikian Insight with Desi Anwar. Jangan lupa Anda juga dapat menyaksikan tayang ini di cnnindonesia.com dan di YouTube CNN Indonesia Insight with Desi Anwar. Sampai jumpa, stay safe. Bye-bye.